Yeah, it's a dystopian future, which is to say the present. Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Phil Thomas, and I do the research and share a story of a video game controversy to my friends.
I'm Elford Stephens, a long-term video game lover.
I'm Andy Hunter, another longtime gamer, just mostly Nintendo stuff.
I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I usually do the research, but I'm curious what's going on here, Phil.
No, I clearly just said in the intro that I always do the research. Now, you're right. Kevin's doing me a favor and letting me host the majority of today's episode on the chip shortage, as chips are my favorite thing in the world. But don't worry, listeners. Kevin's going to come in with some excellent video game history in just a little bit. But until then, let's talk about video game consoles. Let me ask a question to the group here. How long did it take for you to find your PS5? Elford?
I believe it was about 13 months.
Andy, what about you?
Well, I don't actually own a PS5, but I did buy one for my brother, and I finally got the opportunity to do that, I think sometime last fall, maybe?
Okay. Kevin?
I did not even bother trying because the supply shortages were ridiculous. You couldn't find it in any of the stores. And I also could not justify to myself to pay $600 for a system that I was only going to be playing Demon Souls on.
Okay, so I'm in your boat. Most of us on this podcast devoted to video games have not bothered to try to buy a PS5 for ourselves. In many ways, it's because they're still hard to get. And that may be due to something called the chip shortage. Dun, dun, dun. Do, 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 do.
Gasp!
Yes, exactly.
Now, is there a shortage of programming chips? Because like potato chips, you can't just use one. You know, you're programming a thing and, well, this chip works so well in the PS5, I'll just put one more in and another in.
Andy, you might be opening up a can right there, because if computer chips taste like potato chips, you're going to have people busting open their PS5s to get their hands on some of those chips, man.
That actually was the thesis of this episode. Microchips, you can't have just one. Well, that's it for today's episode. Once again, for Scandalous Games, I'm Phil Thomas. No, I'm just kidding. That's not the case. Although I will say that the world is pretty hangry for microchips, so it's not unlike the Lay's snack dilemma. In order to get into that, let me take you back to the year 2020, and a time none of us may like to remember all that fondly, which was the start of the worldwide pandemic. Now, as you recall, what was socialized in the media was that there was a chip shortage happening during the pandemic. Devices like iPhones, Android phones, PS5s, Xbox Series S and X, PlayStation VR, Oculus Quest, Nintendo Switch, computer graphics cards from Nvidia and AMD were all scarce. Even cars from Tesla to the Chevy Malibu were scarce. Demand was also up due to the number of people buying GPUs to mine crypto. And for more on crypto, check out our two-part series on gaming and crypto on Scandalous Games. Now, why were we told that there was a chip shortage? Normally, I've only heard this phrase at parties. This chip shortage, however, would affect things people do by themselves, like playing video games, and the chips needed to handle features like collision detection and parallel parking on some of the newer car models. And you get why that is. It was the pandemic. All of the supply chains of all of the hundreds of companies that supply these chips were all disrupted. The pandemic ground all of the hundreds or thousands of suppliers to these companies to a halt. But what if I told you that it wasn't thousands or hundreds or even dozens of companies? What if I told you all of these companies got their advanced chips from one company located in Taiwan, and they can get it from one company because the chip that goes into each of those devices is essentially the same chip
You've got me intrigued. I'm going to stay tuned for the rest of this episode just to see where you're getting at, Phil.
So what you're saying is that the entire global supply of computer chips, everything from, heart monitoring machines to a PlayStation to a phone, is all being supplied by one single Taiwanese company. Am I hearing that correct?
That's essentially correct, Kevin. What if I told you that this one company produces nearly all of the advanced chips in the world, and that if any one of the myriad problems Taiwan was facing during the pandemic, droughts and political issues, were to prevent the company from producing chips, the world would essentially be thrust into a digital dark age? You would not be able to buy a new smartphone or video game system for as long as TSMC was out of commission. So how did we get here? How are we going to get ourselves out? Before we talk about that, let's talk about the history of microchips. And for that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Kevin Impellizeri. Kevin.
All right, I guess that's my part. I think we should probably start out by asking a really basic question. What is a computer chip and what does it do?
I only know a little bit about electronics and computers. So I was thinking, right, if you were to take apart a VCR, you take out your old VCR, you take it out, you're going to see this big, huge piece of circuitry. And basically, the circuitry is using electronics so that when you push a button, something happens, right? And that circuitry basically controls that for you. It both is a control mechanism and in some ways it stores information, right?
That's exactly right.
So when they started making computers, you needed more and more circuitry to be able to make them do all these amazing things. And if you remember from when we were kids, computers were enormous because they needed all of this circuitry to do all these amazing things until they created this smaller ability to make these circuits, which are microchips. I remember when I was a kid learning that the microchip could do so much more than the regular circuit that we were seeing. There's so much more circuitry in this little tiny chip. And so you could do so much more. And that's how computers are being able to get smaller and smaller, to the point that I tell my children all the time, what you can do on this phone is far superior than what I could have done on a computer 15 years ago, because those chips are so small and yet they have more circuitry in them than you could have put in one of those mega huge computers back in the day. So I kind of spitball in that definition because I have to base it on what I remember learning about. Because I think when we were all in high school, they were teaching us little bits because that was pretty much state of the art at the time, microchips. But I'm learning.
Elford, you're not learning, you're teaching. You just summarized part 2. That was going to take me 20 minutes in like a minute.
Problem is there weren't any jokes. And the jokes is what keeps them coming. There's got to be emotion in it, right?
I did write a joke related to that, so maybe we could shoehorn that in. But that was really good. So I do have some information on advanced chips that I will be getting into a little bit later. But let's stay on track with the question Kevin asked about microchips in general.
I'll just give a really basic definition of what a computer chip is. So
perfect.
A computer chip, it's a small piece of what's called a semiconductor. And a semiconductor is a material that can both act as an insulator and a conductor of electricity. And on this semiconductor are a set of what are called transistors. And transistors are basically devices for amplifying electrical signals. So the way information is processed on a chip is to pass electricity through these transistors, through this semiconductive material. And this is where we get into the history, because it's actually really neat. The history of computer chips is both a history of your standard computer technical development and innovation, and it's also a study in supply chains and international relations. So the concept of passing current through a semiconductor is a surprisingly old idea. The earliest concepts of a semiconductor date back to the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. And there were kind of a lot of talk about how you could pass electrical signals. Now, what they could do with those signals, it kind of developed as they went. They kind of had this concept. Now, what we think of in a modern sense of a computer chip is really a product of the post-World War II period. So in the years following World War II, you saw a bunch of major advances in the technology around semiconductors. So for example, in 1947, a team at Bell Labs developed the first point contact transistors, which was kind of like the first application of this idea of passing electricity through transistors through a semiconductor, which ran on a germanium-based semiconductor. In 1958, an engineer named Jack Kilby, who was at Texas Instruments, devised what's called the first solid circuit or the solid state semiconductor. And this is different from a lot of computing technology was based on what was called gaseous state circuitry. Have you ever heard of things like vacuum tubes? These are tubes of gas that conduct electricity through them. And the solid state was a way of getting away from doing something like that. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want to use vacuum tubes. They're big, they're really energy intensive, and they break constantly. They're really inefficient. And so the development of a solid state system was something that opened up the possibility of having more efficient computing, greater computing power with less energy in a much, much smaller package. So this is in 1958 when they developed the solid circuit. A year later, an American physicist named Robert Noyce patented the first integrated circuit. And so what an integrated circuit is, it's a semiconductor with multiple transistors on it. And this ability to have on one device all of these transistors that could do these processes allowed for computers to become much smaller and much more powerful, and gave way from mainframe computers to what they called in the 1960s microcomputers. So it's, significantly smaller, scaled down, that have more power. And there began to be an idea that as technology advanced, that the amount of transistors per chip would roughly double every 2 years. This is what we call Moore's Law, which is a concept introduced in 1965 by Intel co-founder Gordon E. Moore. This idea of regular doubling of computing power vis-a-vis the number of transistors on a chip. Now, the first devices to use semiconductors, they're coming out beginning in about the 1960s. And as should has come no surprise, because this is kind of where the evolution of computing technologies in general, a lot of it's a product of the Cold War. So you're seeing, acceleration of fears between the Soviet Union and the United States. So you're seeing a lot of technological investment in things like defense and the space program. And so the first places you're really seeing integrated circuits being used is in the defense and space program. So for example, missile guidance systems. During this time, between the 60s into the 1970s, you're seeing the amount of transistors per chip improving, their cost to manufacture is going down. And in addition to going into places like the military and the space program, you begin to see it go into the consumer market. The first consumer products to have semiconductors are coming around in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, with some early examples being calculators and digital watches. And so with all this growing hype over this increased computing power on smaller and smaller packages, some people started thinking about how they could use them for video games. The first commercial home video game system was the Odyssey, which was released in 1972 by Magnavox. Anybody here heard of the Odyssey?
Yeah, I thought it was made by Honda.
No.
It's a name I've heard. I don't think I've ever played on it, or I don't even know if I've seen footage of what games looked like. In my head, I'm picturing like Pong, I guess, but I don't know if that's even accurate.
No, man, never heard of it.
I will show you a brief commercial from roughly 1972 for the Magnavox Odyssey.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future. Odyssey easily attaches to any brand TV, black and white or color, to create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey gives you all the exciting action of hockey and 11 other challenging play and learning games for the entire family. Odyssey, a new dimension for your television, now at your Magnavox dealer. He's listed in the yellow pages.
Oh, all right. And so for the listener, it seems like what the Odyssey could do is basically make squares move around on the screen. And you had to attach like a semi-transparent screen onto your TV screen to create the environment to basically differentiate what should be a game of hockey versus a game of tennis or any other gaming scenario.
Yeah, it's really funny because the only difference between the football game and the ping pong game was that the background for the ping pong game was a ping pong table and the background for the football game was a football field, but it was still one block going back and forth on the screen.
Pinnacle of Nixon era graphical technology.
Also, can I just mention what a mindfuck it is to realize that that video game commercial is 50 years old?
Damn, you're right. Yeah.
Whoa.
So yeah, that's the Odyssey. I will make it clear that the Odyssey is not a chip system. It ran on a set of built-in transistors and diodes combined with a set of removable circuit boards that allowed the users to change the gameplay. And as you pointed out, Andy, pretty much all of that gameplay is deciding exactly how many white squares you wanted projected on your television screen. Because the Odyssey is super primitive, even by the standards of its time. It had no sound, it had no scorekeeping, and outside of those squares had no graphics either. You changed the game you were playing by switching out these Mylar overlays, which you stuck onto your TV screen that had things like a hockey rink, a football field, a roulette table, a tennis court. And the rest of it is you just kind of made your own fun with the Odyssey. You're playing it based on the honor system. So for example, there was a maze-based game where you had to navigate the square through the maze, but it has no collision detection. It doesn't know what it's doing. So it's pretty much you enter an unspoken agreement with whomever you're playing that you're going to try to be as honest as you can. On top of all this, the system also came bundled with a whole bunch of random game pieces, such as dice, poker chips, and play money. So you could either play the pinnacle of early 1970s video game technology, not named Pong, or just keep the thing in the box and spend a rainy afternoon shooting dice with the whole family.
Sounds like the Xbox Kinect that came with the Xbox One.
The Odyssey was probably at best a modest seller, depending on your measure of success. If you want to learn more about it, check out the Video Game History Hours episode on the history of Magnavox, because they talk a lot about both where the expectations were of the company vis-a-vis the Odyssey's success and how much they actually sold. I'll leave a link in the description. Now, going back to chips, the first attempts to develop chip-based video game systems came 2 years later. In 1974, Magnavox entered a deal with Texas Instruments to supply chips that replicated some of the games from the original Odyssey, mostly the tennis variants. So your tennis, your hockey, sorry, States and analogic. You're not coming along for this technological ride. And this was for a new line of home consoles in what came known as the Odyssey series, which first released in 1975. The Odyssey 100, for example, ran on 4 Texas Instruments chips and played tennis and hockey, while the higher-end Odyssey 200 used 6 chips, played tennis and hockey, and it added squash. So it's pretty much any game you like so long as it's basically a tennis-type game. Around the same time, Atari engineers Bob Brown and Harold Lee managed to get Pong running on a single chip. And the company secured an exclusive deal with the retailer Sears to sell the home version of Pong beginning in 1975 under the name Telegames Pong. And in short order, home video games became the hot Christmas item of 1975. For example, Magnavox made 180,000 units in the Odyssey line and sold out by the end of the year. And this prompted one New York Times reporter to declare in a Christmas Day 1975 article, quote, "The delighted cries of young children this Christmas morning will be punctuated in many homes by blips and pongs as families settle down to the latest craze, electric games," end quote.
Wow. Yeah, it's crazy to think that there was a time even before the name video game itself was standardized.
When I see these historic consoles, I'm amazed that video gaming didn't just go away with the Dodo. I mean, I couldn't imagine sitting there playing that football game on the Odyssey when I could just be outside throwing a football. Nowadays, my children are exposed to games that really capture the look and the feel of a game. But 50 years ago, it was a stretch of the imagination for sure.
Well, Elford, while I do agree that that game was not as exciting as the Eagles versus Chiefs Super Bowl, I would say it was much more exciting than the Patriots versus Rams Super Bowl.
Too soon, man.
I think I made the same comparison. That was a good game.
It was a good game that I wish had a different outcome.
Oh my God. Oh, too bad the defense didn't get off the plane.
At least they left Jonathan Gannon in Arizona where he belongs.
That's where everybody goes to retire, right?
But yeah, it's funny you mention that, Elford, because I want to make it clear with these systems, they're what's called a dedicated home system. And what I mean by dedicated home system is that these were games that came with a preset lineup of games on them. They're already pre-installed and they could not be expanded. So like all you had was your football, your hockey. So yeah, you made a really good point. And there were people at the time who thought, there's no way this is going to last. People are going to get bored of this. And that in the writing business is called foreshadowing. The success of the likes of Home Pong and the Odyssey line in 1975 got a whole bunch of other companies thinking that they could make bank on these fancy new electric games. And in 1976, the young home video game market got even more crowded thanks to a Pennsylvania-based electronics company called General Instruments. GI developed a chip in 1976 called the AY3-8500, which significantly lowered the barrier of entry into the home games industry. The so-called Pong on a chip ran 4 tennis variants and 2 shooting game variants on a single chip. And rather than make their own game system to compete with the likes of Atari and Magnavox, General Instruments made the AY3-8500 available for sale to other firms looking for a low-cost entry point into the gaming market. So now, if you were really interested in making a tennis variant of your own, instead of making a system from scratch, a client could buy the chips from GI for between $5 and $6 a chip, depending on your order size, install them at a 50 $15 to $20 case, give it a fancy name like Wonder Wizard or Quadtronics, and put it on shelves in your local Stearns for $100 and in theory make a whole bunch of video game money. And GI's first client was a company called Coleco, short for the Connecticut Leather Company. They were founded in the 1930s, but by the 1970s, they were really getting into toys and I believe above ground swimming pools. They diversified a lot, Coleco.
Wow. Knowing that Coleco started as a leather company is even more mind-blowing to me than when I learned that Nintendo originally made playing cards. Leather into video games is even more of a walk.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a fun story to be had about how Coleco went the direction it did. Because skipping ahead, when the game market crashed in the 80s, they also made bank on another big 1980s sensation. They sold the Cabbage Patch doll.
Whoa.
All right, so like I said, Coleco were the first people who got in on the ground floor with General Instruments' chip, and they bundled the chip in a system they called the Coleco Telstar, which was kind of like their version of Pong, and it was marketed as a low-cost alternative, where a lot of these game systems are marketing for around $100. They sold the Telstar for $50. However, it didn't take long for other firms to get wind of GI's Pong on a chip and put in their own orders, and GI eventually received orders from as many as 70 other companies. Even Magnavox got in the AY3 8500 bandwagon and used the chip in the Odyssey 300. And by January 1977, General Instruments had shipped over 7 million chips. And despite that high number, that was nowhere near enough for General Instruments to keep up with demand, prompting the first video game-related chip shortage, as GI quickly learned they weren't making chips fast enough to cover all of those orders. In fact, Coleco, who got on the ground floor, ended up being the only company to receive their full order, and many others were lucky if they saw 20% of the requested chips.
Oh.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that, GI issues will make you backed up.
God. Oh, man.
Good one.
Even with that low turnover, 1976 and 1977 saw tons of these dedicated home game systems flooding the US market. On top of that, other semiconductor companies got in on the home video game bandwagon and released systems of their own. So for example, National Semiconductor released a system called the Adversary, and Fairchild released a system called the Video Entertainment System. And here is where we get into the Econ 101 segment of the podcast. Now, class, what happens when the supply of a specific good, in this case, thousands upon thousands of electronic tennis games, exceed their demand?
The price would have to go down. Like everybody would have to start lowering their price because now there's more available than people want. Let's just try to get them off the shelves.
Things would be worth almost nothing real quick.
Yeah, if you said the price tanks, then gold stars for you, because that's exactly what happened. Now, people as early as December 1976 were noting that the increasingly crowded home game market was probably going to lead to a culling of the games market. There's just too many people to support it. As they're putting more product out there, they have to start lowering their prices, and they're eventually reaching a point where they're not making money on these things. For example, an industry expert told the New York Times reporter for a December 12, 1976 article on the holiday game craze, quote, "First, you have to realize that there has been an electronic chip shortage. Therefore, there has been a shortage of games manufactured. Now that the supply is beginning to catch up with the need, there are more games and the price goes down. Some of the weaker companies will fall out and profits will rebuild to normal levels," end quote. And that's a kind of level of self-delusion that will be repeated when the home game market crashed in the 1980s. Oh yeah, it'll be fine. Couple people will fall out, but the market's pretty solid. And then it was not. It was totally not. But in any case, the flood of the likes of Super Pong, Video Action 4, and Face-Off Executive Hockey eventually tanked prices thanks to oversupply. And on top of that, and you pointed this out, Elford, it turns out there's not a lot of staying power for dedicated game systems that only played a small handful of games, many of which were just some variation of tennis. Because, how much tennis is eventually too much tennis? And after the novelty wears off, you're left with effectively a $100 dust collector sitting on your TV set or taking up space in your closet or basement. And as a result, by 1977, the market for these games completely collapsed, and the few that managed to survive this crash were those that either developed digital versions of games that weren't tennis. For example, they would diversify to things like driving games, or pivoted towards what came to be known as programmable game systems. These are ones that ran removable cartridges, with some systems around this time the likes of the Fairchild Video Entertainment System I mentioned a few minutes ago, and Atari's Video Computer System, aka the Atari 2600, which released in 1977. And even then it was dicey, because Atari had to get bought out by media conglomerate at Warner Communications to get the 2600 off the ground into the stores. And Coleco did survive long enough to put out the ColecoVision in 1982, but not before losing about $30 million. And while all this was happening, the semiconductor business at large was getting bigger and bigger as Americans saw more and more products reliant on computer chips. And here we get to talk about some business history mixed with a little bit of international relations. And I hope this will set up the foundation for when Phil talks to us about what the state of the chip business is now. The chip market in the 80s in general was really volatile. Case in point, there was another chip shortage in the early 1980s. And this time was brought about because a bunch of tech firms in the United States really bet heavy on home computers. They really wanted to push for the home computer revolution to happen in the early 1980s, and there were a bunch of different computers out on the market with the hope that it would eventually catch on for consumers. They were making their ways into business, and now they're trying to make their way into American homes. A lot of manufacturing going behind computers, and as a result, there's a lot of production, and so as a result, that's a huge demand for chips. And so between about 1982 and 1984, there's a huge push to make home computers a thing, and as a result, chip makers are ramping up their production, hoping, everyone's going to storm into their local Radio Shack and buy up as many TRS-80s as their bank accounts will allow, which left companies struggling to keep up with demand, not unlike what happened with General Instruments. And as a result of that, supplies are getting tougher and costs are going up. So for example, Intel, which supplied the 8088 chip on which many IBM-compatible computers ran, including the IBM PC, they stopped accepting new clients in late 1983 and even announced they were building a whole new factory in Albuquerque, New Mexico to keep up with this demand. However, by about 1984, the demand for home computers had basically leveled out. And it leveled out for a number of different reasons, many of which we'll actually cover in a future episode when we talk about the video game crash in the 80s. And so as a result of that, the sales, they level off. And as a result of that, the chip prices start to drop because there's now this oversupply. So between 1984 and 1985, chip prices plummeted. And the American semiconductor industry had a pretty big crash. It contracted by as much as 60%. Texas Instruments and Micron were like a couple of the notable survivors of this, but it cleared out a lot of American semiconductor companies. And then on top of that, there's Japan, which had made significant strides in the chip business during the late 70s and into the 80s. Now, overall, the semiconductor market, even with the Japanese intrusion in the 1980s, remained predominantly American. However, Japanese companies began making inroads into a very specific sector of the chip market called dynamic random access memory chips, or DRAM chips. And DRAM chips were appearing in a lot of consumer electronics at the time, computers, VCRs, things like that. So they're cornering a very specific part of the market. And they controlled by the mid-80s as much as 75% of this market. Although when you take into account the market as a whole, Japan only got about a 12% share of the American semiconductor market. Just keeping things into perspective. How then did American semiconductor manufacturers respond to this growing competition from Japan? I'm going to give you three choices how they respond. Did they A, increase DRAM production and lower prices to make their products more attractive to manufacturers? B, get back to the drawing board and develop new advances in chip tech with the interest of high quality over low cost? Or C, whine to the government and pressure lawmakers to start a trade war against Japan? What do we think?
I'm going to go with A.
Even before you listed the options, was that, they were going to say like, oh, yeah, let's, put a tariff on Japanese goods or stop importing. Yeah, but just get off my lawn, Japanese businesses.
I remember on this podcast, the answer is always one of those choices, but I forget which one.
Pretty sure it's A.
Now, longtime listeners of this show will know that whenever I offer the three options, the answer is always C.
What?
And a number of big advocates of the free market wanted the government to help bail them out when they faced market competition. Because American companies were not content with only controlling most of the chip industry. They wanted all of it. And in 1977, a group of semiconductor-related companies formed a trade organization called the Semiconductor Industry Association, or the SIA, and started aggressively lobbying the federal government to do something about this Japanese chip invasion. Their biggest complaint was to accuse Japanese companies of doing something called dumping. And dumping is a practice where they were basically selling DRAM chips for well below their market value. Japanese manufacturers are saying that, whether that's true or not, you also have an overwhelming monopoly on, for example, the American defense business, and that we're controlling the small part, but you control the bigger part of the business. But there's this constant push in the early part of the 1980s among the American semiconductor companies for the government to step in. And after a series of lengthy federal investigations between 1985 and 1986, they got their way. The U.S. government managed to get the Japanese government to sign a semiconductor accord in 1986. In it, the Japanese government made a whole bunch of concessions. The Japanese government agreed to crack down on dumping and also promised promised international companies would get as much as a 20% share of the Japanese chip market within 5 years. Tokyo also advised local chip companies to start scaling back production. On top of that, the Reagan administration likely cowing to pressure from other American industries that felt threatened by Japanese competition, because this is during the time when you're beginning to see a lot of inroads among Japanese manufacturers into U.S. markets, places like consumer electronics and automobiles. This is kind of part of that Japanese manufacturing invasion in the 1980s. And so a bunch of industries are pushing the Reagan administration to do something about that. And so in April of 1987, the Reagan administration imposed the harshest economic sanctions against Japan since World War II. Washington levied a 100% tariff on up to $300 million in Japanese imports. That basically means that domestic importers, industries that work in the United States who bring in Japanese goods and they sell them, now have to pay a tax that is equal to the value of that particular good. And basically what that means then is to offset the cost, they have to raise the prices when they sell them. They're doing this so that people are financially disincentivized to rely on foreign goods and they do more domestic stuff. So basically the U.S. starts a trade war, in part because of concerns over semiconductors. And so what does all this wheeling, dealing, and Reaganeering have to do with video games? The American backlash against chip dumping had a really obvious side effect, because following the semiconductor accord, chip prices started going up, which is admittedly pretty sweet if you're Texas Instruments or Micron and your whole business is manufacturing and selling chips, because it means you're going to make more money in your chips. However, it's really bad for companies that say make products that run on semiconductors, like auto manufacturers, computer and telecommunications firms, and video game companies, all of which benefit from low chip costs because it cuts down on their manufacturing costs. To make matters worse, American chip manufacturers also made some really bad bets in the late 1980s. Probably to cut into the Japanese DRAM business, American semiconductor companies began phasing out making their own DRAM chips in favor of 1 megabit chips, so more powerful chips. However, instead of building new facilities to make these new chips, they basically cannibalized their existing manufacturing operations and cut down on their DRAM production and turn those into these 1 megabit chip manufacturing apparatuses. And the problem with that is that these 1 megabit chips were significantly more expensive to manufacture and they took a lot more time. So as a result of that, you're still seeing high costs from those chips. You're seeing supply go down for the other chips. And as a result of supply going down, prices keep going up. So to give you a sense of how much costs change in terms of these issues between the trade war and the changes in chip costs, the unit cost of the 1 megabit chip went up from $199 to $505 in a single month in 1988. And DRAM prices went from $2.95 a chip at the start of 1988 to $12.45 by the end of the year. So huge increase in unit prices. And the shortage of chips is being felt all throughout the United States and any businesses that rely on semiconductors, including the video game industry. And facing both rising cost and lowering chip supplies, many game makers had to make some big choices. And a lot of them responded by phasing older games out of production so that they can open up that manufacturing space for their newer games. And they also pushed back the release dates of a bunch of newer games. For example, the chip shortage in 1988 forced Nintendo to push back the American release date of two very highly anticipated NES sequels, Super Mario Bros. 2 and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Both of them got their release dates pushed back because of the chip shortage.
Is that why they both were also inferior compared to their predecessors?
Wow, shots fired.
I didn't know that chips had so much to do with the gameplay. Both games came back with a roaring number 3.
No argument there.
I know these chips are so important. You got my attention, man.
And on top of that, there were some game manufacturers who were so desperate for chips, they thought about making their own factories. For example, an Atari representative told the Los Angeles Times reporter covering the 1988 Summer Consumer Electronics Show that the company was considered building their own factory to offset the shortage. And this chip shortage lasted well into 1989. By 1989, though, supplies finally caught up to demand. The high tariffs went away, and eventually the manufacturing apparatus caught up. Japanese manufacturers ramped up their production. American DRAM manufacturers also saw another competitor in South Korea. South Korea started getting into the chip business. And as a result, the supply kind of caught up and evened itself out. Prices went back down. But yeah, I think all of this ties into, and I've kind of gone a lengthy way, to say that from its inception, the semiconductor and the semiconductor industry has always been kind of fraught with political and economic implications on a domestic and an international level. And that both supplies and the negotiations of different countries and different businesses can have really far-reaching consequences for the way we experience technology. And so with that, I'm going to pass the time back to Phil to talk about the more contemporary stuff.
Thanks, Kevin.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about a microchip in a very long time. I just accept microchips as a part of electronics and computers, never really think about it.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't think when I started talking to Kevin about the chip shortage that this story would be as interesting as it is. But there's a lot of geopolitics involved.
2 questions. Maybe you know the answer. So I'm thinking that cartridges likely have some microchip in them, right? And so the question is, because Nintendo still uses cartridges, right? Or no, those are solid state drives, aren't they? I don't know if those have a microchip. Well, I would think they would have a microchip in there. I don't know. Is Nintendo experiencing a shortage of being able to make their cartridges? Because it doesn't seem like Nintendo's had a problem releasing games.
For the Switch, you mean?
Yeah.
There actually have been supply chain issues with the Nintendo Switch. But the fact of the matter is, and we'll get into this later, how advanced the chip is directly proportional to how short of a supply there is.
Okay.
Because it's like the more complicated it is, the less companies can make it. So if it's a less complicated chip, you have more options as to where you get your chip. So Kevin, that 80s chip shortage was brought about by a trade war with Japan. But that's the last time a trade war with an Asian nation caused a chip shortage in America, right?
Thank God.
Wrong.
What?
So let's go to our next section. What are these advanced chips anyway? So companies like Apple, PlayStation, and Nintendo didn't always outsource their chips. They call themselves manufacturers, and they used to manufacture their own chips. In order to understand why they stopped, let's talk a little more about why this technology needs to get smaller and smaller. A microchip is an electronic device used to perform calculations. These calculations are done using transistors, and calculations are typically done in binary. So what does that mean? Any technology that can have 2 states and can have those states changed at scale can make something that functions like a modern binary computer. If you were stranded on a desert island, if you wanted, you could make an analog computer out of coconuts and bamboo. And if my career doesn't work out, this is my fallback plan.
I'm there with you, man.
Yeah. Solid plan.
Yeah, it's good to have a backup plan in case of startup collapse in, I don't know, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, it's a dystopian future, which is to say the present.
So you're saying that we could theoretically make the coconut radio from Gilligan's Island, is what you're saying, right? As a computer.
Nice.
Not just a coconut radio, Kevin. We could make a coconut calculator. We could make a coconut smartphone. We could make a coconut computer. We could make a coconut Game Boy. You would need several different people to help you carry it around because it would weigh as much as a boy, but you could do it. Anywho, the state of a transistor translates to the state of that piece of binary data, also called a bit. So if your material is a conductor, all of the transistors would be stuck in the 1 position because electricity is going through them and it can't stop. So if all of your transistors were made of conductors, everything would be set to 1 and you couldn't do anything. And if all of your transistors are non-conductors, all of your transistors would be stuck in the 0 position. So you also can't do any calculations. They're all just stuck in the other position. So what does that mean? You need a device that can be a conductor only in certain situations. A semiconductor. Yeah. That's what a semiconductor is. So heat is used to change the state of each transistor. This is why processors get hot the more you use them.
And why I need to somehow figure out how to unscrew my PS4 and like vacuum out all of the dust that is clogging up that fan.
Yeah, if you ever wanted to know why are people liquid cooling their processors so they can run faster? Like if they run too fast, it means that there's more and more heat being thrust through all of the transistors. And if it gets too hot, then all of a sudden, some of the transistors start flipping from 0s to 1s by mistake. So the colder you can keep the processor and still keep flipping bits, it's like the faster you can run it.
Oh, and so that's why like computer rooms are always kept really cold. My dad worked in hardware and he would go into server rooms and it was always really cold. And that's interesting. So I guess that makes sense. That's neat to know.
Well, you're bringing back bad memories of the Xbox One and that huge fan it must have had in it. So when you turned it on, it was like, woo, and I couldn't hear the game.
I'll do you one better. Think of the Xbox 360, how you had to keep that thing elevated or else it would die. We may do the red ring of death at some point.
I think a lot of gamers probably are familiar with that because you can hear the fan. My PS4, I had it on some flexible material that I rolled into little balls so that as the fan vibrated, it wouldn't make any noise.
So that's actually what's behind when stuff starts to break down when a processor gets too hot. Some of those transistors are accidentally flipping to ones where they shouldn't be. And there's all sorts of stuff that can accidentally get those things. So like gamma radiation, there could be like a stray bolt of whatever coming out of space and it could flip a 0 to a 1. That's why these things are so precarious. So we know why processors overheat when you do too many calculations at once, right? You can carve transistors into a silicon chip. And the more transistors you have, the more calculations you can do. This is why the race is to make transistors and chipsets smaller and smaller so that you can print more of them on one large silicon plate and so that you can do more with them if you make your transistors smaller and smaller. Pretty soon, American companies started to hit the limits of what they could produce on their own. And like many businesses, in order to cut costs and improve performance, they looked overseas. There were 2 Asian companies that could handle the printing of advanced chips. They each had sophisticated lasers that you need to print them. Pretty soon, all those companies that used to pride themselves on making their own hardware, like Apple and Nintendo and a couple of other major players, they continued to design their own chips, but they sent those designs overseas to have them printed. So they quietly went from being chip manufacturers, which was a selling point of their product, to chip designers who sent their designs overseas to be fabricated. The companies overseas are now usually referred to as chip fabricators or chip fabs or foundries. And as we'll get into, the more advanced your chip gets, the fewer and fewer places there are to fabricate it. Consumer demand forced the chips to get more and more advanced. Think about how the introduction of the iPhone in 2008 pushed this into overdrive. Think about the amount of computing power needed to power something that can fit in a phone small enough to fit in people's pockets. The microchips have to simultaneously have more transistors and get smaller. Pretty soon, the chips were so advanced that only 2 major companies in the world, besides Samsung, could produce them. Samsung can only produce a limited amount outside of what it needs for its own electronics. The 2 companies largely responsible for this were SMIC, largely in mainland China, and TSMC, largely in Taiwan. Semiconductor Manufacturing International China, SMIC, and Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC. These are 2 foundries or chip fabs. So for a while, these 2 suppliers were keeping up with the demand for more and more advanced chipsets for all of the advanced devices you have come to know and love. Gaming consoles, computers, smart features in cars, and everyone's favorite household item, a missile guidance system. So what happened? Remember the trade war with China during the Trump administration?
Yeah, the thing that we were winning so much in, right?
That's right. Yes, there was lots of winning.
He was great at making deals and building walls, I think also was another of his famous accomplishments.
Yeah, I mean, the art of the deal.
Also stopping pandemics from reaching our shores, right? That was like another big accomplishment of his.
I'm glad you all summarized that so factually accurately for me. Well, in 2018, Trump ordered the imposition of tariffs on Chinese products, the filing of a WTO case against China, and restrictions on Chinese investments in high-tech sectors of the U.S. economy. That's from a Wikipedia entry on the China trade war. So when America started a trade war with China, these companies, largely headquartered in the U.S., had to shift their manufacturing outside of China. This means they could no longer use SMIC. This means that TSMC was their only choice, and TSMC responded by building more foundries to accommodate that increased demand. So that's how we ended up with TSMC as the lone advanced chip manufacturer in the world outside of Samsung. It was the only company that could produce these chips at scale that the world needed.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm following you, because I'm just a layperson here. there. When Obama was president, he had this trade agreement with part of Asia. And then when Trump went in, it was a big thing for him to renegotiate all of that. And you're saying part of it basically led to these American companies being unable to buy chips from this company in China. And since there was only 2 companies that made them, they had to buy them from the company in Taiwan. So basically, the supply of chips that could be purchased was suddenly reduced. And at the same time, the company in Taiwan now has to try to rapidly expand because we love iPhones. I was at the gym today and I went to get one of those sanitation wipes. You know, you're supposed to wipe things down. And there's a dude there and he was doing these jumps. So, by the way, these guys, I don't know if you guys do this, but like jump from standing onto a block that's like 3 feet off the ground. He was doing that holding like a 25-pound weight. I was amazed, like I could even do that jump. So I'm behind him. And I go look, they had the sanitation wipe, and there's 2 cell phones there. And I'm thinking, there's got to be a cell phone, but did someone else put their cell phone? But then I see both cell phones have the same exact case. And I'm like, they're probably both his cell phone. He does have 2 ears, right? You know, we love cell phones.
We're 2-car households and we're 2-phone people.
Obviously, now I know we love semiconductors.
Oh, yeah, we do. So if he bought a Samsung phone, the microchip in that phone probably would have come from South Korea. But if he bought any other phone, like any other, that microchip came from TSMC in Taiwan.
And all of this is just since you said 2018, right? The trade war started.
Mm.
That's astonishing. Is this in terms of the global chip economy, or is this specifically focused on American companies? Like, are there people still dealing with mainland China?
So there are hardware manufacturers in China like Huawei, and there are a couple of other large brands that are global brands, but also serve the 1 billion plus person Chinese market. And they could still have their stuff fabricated by SMIC. So SMIC is still getting business, just not as much business as they used to. And since so many of these companies, you know, Apple, Microsoft, PlayStation, since they have global headquarters in the United States and are selling to the US market, to impose those types of tariffs and trade restrictions, it's going to be so destructive to your margins as a company that you're just going to have to look for another fabricator.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, wow.
Yeah. So if you want a game system, you have to go through one of these companies. And these companies are now no longer going to have their things fabricated in China.
But Phil, I ask, what if I decide I'm going to go I'm going to AliExpress and I'm going to get my PlayStation ordered direct from Guangzhou, and it's going to play Car Stealing Grandness 5.
I love that game.
Oh, wait a minute. Which version? Car Stealing Grandness 5 Spice City? I heard that was a good one. Well, I thought what you were going to ask was, well, I'm going to make my own chip manufacturer. I'm going to have my own fabrication factory, and I'm going to build one in the United States, right?
You don't know that I don't already have one.
Why do you think Kevin is so flush with Scandal Coin? He doesn't need to wait for the GMUs to come in. He makes them himself.
So I know for probably almost certainty that you cannot create one of these factories yourself. And I'll tell you exactly why. Do you want to know why there's only essentially one company in the world that can make these?
Do tell.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, we talked about how since the chips are getting smaller and smaller, you need more and more sophisticated technology to print them, right? And at that point, they're so small that you need a laser to print these things. And with that, let's talk about the most important company in the world that you have never heard of. So one of the reasons only a handful of companies in the world can print these chips is due to the complexity. What are the 2 factors? The more transistors you squeeze onto a chip, the more calculations you can do, which roughly translates to how powerful the chip is. So you have to pack more and more transistors into a smaller and smaller chip to fit into today's high-powered mobile and electronic devices. Chips are now so small and so powerful that the size of the transistors that are used occur at the atomic level. This technology sounds impossibly advanced, and it nearly is. In fact, it is so advanced that in order to carve transistors into a tiny silicon chip, it requires what many people consider to be the most complicated machine ever created by humans. It's a laser called a EUV lithography machine. EUV stands for extreme ultraviolet light, and that's the laser technology that's used used to carve transistors at the atomic level. So in everyone's pocket right now is a microchip packed with tens of thousands of atomically sized transistors carved using the most advanced technology humanity has ever produced. It is so advanced that only one company in the world can make these machines. Advanced Semiconductor Materials Lithography, ASML, which is headquartered in the Netherlands. A single machine used to carve transistors into smartphone chips costs between $200 to $300 million. One machine. It's so expensive that most companies cannot afford it. And when we say most, we mean some of the biggest companies in the world. Now, TSMC in 2019 bought 40% of the machines produced by ASML. And TSMC is the most advanced chip manufacturer in the world. No one can keep up with the complexity and the scale at which they are able to fabricate. So, from a CNBC video on ASML, chips are made from silicon, an abundant element found in rocks in the sand that is purified, melted down, then sliced into circular wafers, the surface on which chips are built in a grid formation. Each wafer can have dozens of thin layers, making up billions of transistors that determine what the chips can do. These layers are printed using lithography. Extremely precise rays of light are projected through a mask of the chip design. When the light hits the surface of the wafers, which have been coated with photoresist chemicals, it prints the minuscule designs on each layer at extremely high volumes. This is a quote from Chris Miller, who's the author of the book, The Chip War. If you think of a typical processor chip in an iPhone, for example, will have over 10 billion transistors on a chip, and Apple will sell 100 million or more iPhones for each model that's rolled out. So you're already talking in numbers that are far bigger than you or I remember how to pronounce.
Wow.
Wow.
The smallest transistors are more than 10,000 times thinner than a human hair. The designs have gotten so small, ASML had to develop new methods of printing that are at the very edge of known physics. ASML says an EUV machine churns out about 3,000 wafers a day. There can be hundreds of chips on a 300 millimeter wafer and up to 10 billion transistors per chip. These chips are so advanced that in order to create a competitor to, say, ASML, it would take you 10 years to catch up to where they are now. And this is why there are no other companies that do this. Financially, it's just not lucrative or possible to fund a company that wouldn't be able to produce anything for 10 years. And the thing it could produce would be 10-year-old technology. That's why ASML is the leader in the world and the sole company that can produce the machines that produce the most advanced chips that we use.
So it's sort of like the scenario that, people like me who try to avoid using Amazon fear will eventually be the case when Amazon succeeds in driving every other company in the world out of business, is that like, oh, well, now even if somebody else wanted to, they can't compete anymore. Basically, all those companies 10, 15, 20 years ago when they were deciding, oh, it just makes more sense to just outsource our chip manufacturing. They were just setting the table for like, wait, guys, we all made the same decision at the same time. None of the rest of you decided to also keep making chips. Oh, no, I thought you were going to keep making chips. Well, I guess we have to invite the one guy who still makes chips to the party. Otherwise, there won't be any chips at this party.
So, Phil, then does that mean that this one company can effectively set the prices and set the supply for global chips? Like that's wild.
They could essentially charge whatever they want for those machines, and they do. And even at that price, only one or two companies in the world can afford this. And they only need those two companies. Like, who buys these machines? TSMC, obviously. SMIC in China, who does far less business because of the trade war. Samsung, who designs and prints their own phones. And this company called Intel, which, used to do cool stuff, but we haven't heard from in a while. But let's get into them a little bit later. So we now know there's significant risk around ASML as the one company that produces this machine. In my mind, when we talk about cell phones and new technology, you think as a layperson, oh, isn't it cool where we're at as a society? It's cool that we can do these things. That's where we've gotten to. But there's no we there. There's one company that produces this machine. Like, Like they got to this point in technology, and their technology is used everywhere by billions and billions of people, that one machine. So if something happened to ASML, we can start to think about what the risk would be to the world.
Wow. So if this is jumping ahead, let me know that we'll just get to it later. I feel like President Biden, I feel like he's said things to the effect of, we will now be making chips here in the United States. And so, of course, you've explained why, even a country with the resources of the United States can't just wave a magic wand and we're suddenly making the chips here. But do you know, like, what does the outlook look like for any of that manufacturing happening in other locations and under different companies' purview? Or will we just be covering that later?
That's a great fucking question. And we'll be getting into that right now. So before we talk about whether or not we can create some of these factories here with all of Kevin's money that he got from Scandal Coin, let's talk about what these factories are like. So what is TSMC? How does it work? How do these foundries work? How do they print this stuff? We know they bought some of the lasers. What do they do with them? Right. So what if something happened to TSMC? SMIC still exists, but rarely produces anything for U.S. companies because of the tariffs and the trade war. They largely only focus on Chinese advanced chip markets for manufacturers like, say, Huawei. But what about the rest of the world? If something were to happen to TSMC and none of the TSMC foundries produced chips, the world would essentially be plunged into a digital dark age. Essentially, no new smartphones, video game consoles, computer graphics cards, VR headsets, or cars with advanced features would be produced in the world.
No smartphones? No.
You couldn't even upload a TikTok of you doing that, Elford.
Luckily, Elford, you know somebody at the gym who has one cell phone to spare, though. So,
hey, man, you got a phone? I got money.
Nah, bro. Nah.
Do anything.
Anything? Why don't you jump up on this box without bending your knees?
Will require tests of strength to determine who gets a phone.
It'd be like the apocalypse.
It would be like the apocalypse. We would have to start recycling phones and updating old phones or going back to like a more primitive technology. That's a potential outcome of if for some reason TSMC could not produce any of these chips. The only company outside of China that could keep going would be Samsung, which produces all of its advanced chips in South Korea. And they can print advanced chips at this complexity for other companies. They just can't do it at the scale that TSMC can. They could do it like 1/10 or 1/5 of the scale. So now that we know that, good thing Taiwan during the pandemic was not beset by multiple issues that put it in a precarious place. Oh, wait a minute. There is still a tense political situation going on between China and Taiwan right now. And TSMC's position as essentially the global manufacturer of the advanced chips of record is a chip that it uses against China invading.
Wow. I know that mainland China every so often threatens to do that. Pretty much ever since the nationalist government fled there in 1949. It's amazing that is helping hold back something like that. It's fascinating.
So a lot of what I'm learning today is new to me. One of the things that I had heard in my very conservative professional life with colleagues discussing with me is this fact that there's this issue with Taiwan and their production of microchips is preventing China from something. But I'm learning now that China actually can produce its own microchips. So
yeah, there's a couple of different things we could infer there. And also let me state for the record that I understand, depending on who's listening to this podcast, we're trading into some fairly touchy subject matter. Both China and Taiwan lay claim to the name China. And I understand that just by the way I refer to these countries, I could be offending some of our listeners depending on what your political or regional stances are. I mean no offense and apologies for that, for me using the shorthand that we use in the United States. But so our folks at home can understand what's going on. That's why I'm referring to these two countries by those two names.
I can even jump in for a little bit of context there. So I have a little bit of knowledge of Chinese history in this regard. So mainland China was under a nationalist government up until 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party managed to defeat the nationalists. The nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and the current stance stance of both political entities vis-a-vis Taiwan's relationship to mainland China varies. So, for example, the government that's on Taiwan sees themselves as the true Chinese government. And for a long time, the United States acknowledged that too. It wasn't until 1970 that the Taiwanese government was on, for example, the UN Security Council up until about 1979. I won't necessarily go in there, but like for the longest time, the US government was a backer of nationalist China. It took a lot of finagling for them to finally recognize the Communist Chinese government as the mainland government.
Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with a couple of quick corrections because I screwed up a whole bunch of Chinese history dates here. So the nationalist Chinese government lost its seat on the UN Security Council in 1971. It had been a founding member of the United Nations and part of the Security Council since 1945. However, in 1971, it lost its spot to the People's Republic China, the Beijing government. The United States didn't formally open up relations with the People's Republic of China. That again is the Beijing government, not the Taiwan government, on January the 1st, 1979. So apologies for the errors there. Back to the show.
So the Taiwanese government sees themselves as the one true China. Meanwhile, the mainland Chinese government, led by the Chinese Communist Party, views Taiwan as a wayward province, with some places saying that it's a contested territory, but basically saying that it is part of mainland China. And the relationship of Taiwan vis-a-vis mainland China has been one of the political footballs of the 20th into the 21st century.
You know, I feel like America should just intervene, right? Like Americans' intervention in other countries' affairs has never worked out poorly. So I'm kidding, of course.
Andy fucking bailed out of that joke. He was like, oh shit, this is the deep end of the pool. I don't know if I want this smoke.
All right. So if I'm understanding correctly, so we've got a really tenuous political position in which this company on Taiwan is a check on the mainland Chinese government can only kind of do so much saber rattling towards Taiwan because basically this one country has control of the entire global chip supply.
Yeah, you can see why this is the crux of, if we were playing, I don't know, Settlers of Catan or Monopoly or whatever. Yeah, this is Boardwalk and Park Place.
Wow.
Okay. Like, this is the one that you've got to get. And that's why there's so much tension in the patrolling of the strait between Taiwan and China. You can see why Taiwan would threaten, listen, if you invade, no one in the world gets a PlayStation 5. Like, say goodbye to them. Like, no Xboxes, no PlayStation 5, no iPhones, nothing. And that's a big deal.
Yeah. The way politics works is, most of your citizens just don't pay attention unless you do something that causes them to pay attention. And if suddenly nobody can get a cell phone anymore and nobody can get their video games anymore, everybody's going to be in heat for something to happen.
Right. And think about modern cars. They're starting to take features out of modern luxury cars like wireless charging and all the other like smart car features. These might start to come out of luxury cars. You would have to buy an older car to find these features.
Wow. Are they trying to protect themselves so they don't have to stop production of their car because of the microchip issue?
Yeah, I mean, because, think about how big of a loss that would be and already has been that they couldn't ship these cars during the pandemic. That's another reason why during the pandemic cars were so hard to come by.
Now, just to circle back to PlayStation, I have felt kind of bad for some of the developers who've produced some games that have flopped, in particular Cyberpunk. And a large reason was that people couldn't get PS5s, right? Because I never played Cyberpunk on the PS5, but what I remember reading is it plays fine on PS5. It doesn't play fine on PS4. And when 95% of people are playing it on PS4, huge problem. Not that there were other problems there, but I feel like other companies too took a real risk making a PS5 game.
And I wonder if that's also why this has felt like one of the weirdest console generations in the sense that we have these next gen systems and like there's still a lot of cross-platform games. Like a lot of the new games that are coming out are still being available for both the PS5 and the PS4. I don't think I can think of a comparable example where this one we've been technically in the next gen for a couple of years now, and we are still in the expectation that the last gen hardware needs to hold up.
Wow. So I've got another question. So did you guys all have the old PS4 or the newer PS4?
I have the newer one. I have the thin one.
I've got the older one.
I think I'm the original, although I'd have to, I bought mine refurbished.
I'm wondering, it seemed like the newer one was a little faster. Did they use newer microchips in those newer ones to improve the performance?
I don't know that for a fact, but you would have to think that if it's thinner, it can be because there are less heating issues with the processor. Either the processor can do more without running as hot, or they have a fan system or architecture that can keep it colder. But that's just a guess. But it's cool that we all know how chips work on a low level, because now just based on that one fact, we can extrapolate all sorts of stuff about how they're building new processors. So there's more to talk about with TSMC. So let me go through the rest of that history and then try to bring us in for a landing. So we know that there's a tense geopolitical situation going on with Taiwan and that TSMC is prominently involved. Now let's talk about these foundries themselves and what they have to be set up for in order to produce these chips. So these are kind of weird environments. In addition to having these machines that can produce these chips at an atomic level, think about how like a stray particle flying through the air in between the laser and, these super precious silicon disks, think about how that could fuck up a whole plate of chips. It's one of the reasons why these entire facilities, which are gigantic, are some of the cleanest environments on the face of the earth. They are factors and factors more clean than your average operating room. You have to have multiple layers of clean suits, and then there are air locks. It's an extremely ultra clean environment. Each one of these factories in the world, each foundry, and TSMC has multiple foundries in Taiwan. In order to clean them, each one in one day runs through 600,000 gallons of water.
Whoa.
Per day. And during the pandemic, Taiwan was beset by one of the biggest droughts in its history.
Oh my God.
It was an epic drought from 2020 through 2021. So in Taiwan, at that point, you have the imminent threat of Chinese invasion. You have the worst drought anybody alive had seen at that point, and the pandemic.
I'm imagining being on the board of directors of that company, man. Heartburn.
Dude. And yet people can't get enough of these chips. So even though this is so risky, this is the only place to get them. And those are some of the factors behind the government and what Andy alluded to earlier, the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America Act, the CHIPS Act, passed in August 2022. So thanks to the CHIPS Act, companies are starting to build foundries in the USA. Intel is one manufacturer domestically that could do this. Remember when Intel was all the rage in the late 90s and those doop, doo, 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 doop commercials?
Yeah, the Intel inside, man.
Yeah, and the people dancing to funk music in clean suits. Yeah, I remember those.
Yeah, and then all the Dell commercials. Dude, you're getting a Dell with Intel. Doop, doo, 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 doop. Like, what happened to them? Weren't they like the shit? So here's what happened to Intel. They stopped innovating as quickly as they were in the 90s when they were the world's leader. Other companies started to produce more advanced chips. Manufacturers of record started to outsource to those companies because they could print more advanced chips than anybody else could. And Intel started to fall by the wayside. Intel has tried over and over again over the past decade to produce an advanced chip as advanced as the ones produced by TSMC. And it can't. It's failed over and over and over and over again. And it's really embarrassing as an American that Intel, which was the silicon standard in this area, cannot do this, but they're trying with the CHIPS Act to catch up so that from a security perspective and a geopolitical perspective, we can start to produce these chips domestically.
But you know what? Intel is still inside my heart.
Aww.
I believe in you, Intel.
So thanks to the CHIPS Act, companies are starting to build foundries in the USA. Intel is the one manufacturer domestically that could do this. However, they haven't been able to produce a chip good enough in 10 years. If Intel can get its act together, this would help tremendously. Also, you know who just built a new foundry in Arizona? TSMC. So Taiwan Semiconductor is starting to build foundries outside of Taiwan to mitigate the risk of themselves being invaded. And also because so much of the assembly of these products happens domestically, even if the parts are produced overseas. So even if we build more foundries, they all have one fatal flaw. The transistors are so small that they are atomic, and they can only be printed by ASML's EUV lithography machine. So even if we bring more of these foundries to the US mainland domestically, we still have to figure out how to mitigate risk around, the most advanced machine ever created by humans, just so we can send out tweets.
And play our games where we pretend to shoot robots.
Pretend to shoot robots or shoot and miss.
You got to crush that candy, man. That candy's just looking at me. It needs to be crushed.
I could go to the moon, or I could crush this candy.
I've got my little farm. My farm needs management.
How else am I supposed to become the Elden Lord?
There you go.
I mean, I guess I could just go around saying I'm Elden Lord.
Yeah, but how do you become Elden Lord unless you do it again and again and again and again and again? So anyway, that's where we're at with the chip shortage.
Wow, that's wild. Like basically all of this, the technology that everything from being on our phone to us doing this recording is all precariously positioned on the fortunes of basically one company in Taiwan and one other manufacturer based in the Netherlands.
That's right. So right now, we're making strides towards, well, ever since the collapse of the crypto industry. And to hear more about that, check out our 2-part series on crypto and gaming. There's been less of a demand for the GPUs that were driving up demand during the pandemic. So there's less of a demand there. With the easing of the pandemic and some other restrictions, we have less factors injecting risk into TSMC. And now we have plants coming to the US mainland. So those are steps we're taking in the right direction. But ASML being the only company that can do that is still a huge risk. So since this is my first time hosting an episode, I'm really stoked to do this. I'm going to go around the group to get people's final thoughts. Let me start with Andy.
I feel like brought into focus general concerns that I had about consumerism in general and the extent to which, we're consolidating power. Certainly I was already aware that economically we were consolidating power in fewer and fewer hands. I didn't realize that also just logistically we were consolidating power in as few hands as we were. So, that's a little bit of a scary thought. Also, global warming is going to eventually heat up all the chips. So eventually none of these are going to work anyways.
That's right. Kevin?
I don't know what else to say that hasn't already been said, but again, the thing that blows my mind about this is just how precariously positioned so much of global technology is positioned in these sort of small concentrations. Andy, you pointed out, it's it's part of it is what capitalism has been doing, these slower consolidations, but also just the thought that between a global pandemic and the risk of natural disasters, which are going to be exacerbated with things like climate change, with things like this drought, that combine with that with geopolitical things like that constant thing that the Beijing government is occasionally say, we're going to take Taiwan back into the fold at some point. And all of these things just precariously positioned together. It's just you feel so terrifyingly powerless over that. I guess that's all I got with that. I was like, wow.
Fortunately for me, I have a backlog of probably 120 video games. Probably 40% of them are AAA games that I haven't even been able to play. And so I feel comfortable because I know that if there's no more microchips for the next 5 years, I have several consoles that are still functioning and I'll be okay because I can be playing a lot of great games. Some games I have played and I just want to get back into, like Fallout 3 and Fallout 4. I have some games that I'm not that interested in, but they were great games, top rated. I have so many games. I feel like I'm well positioned in this situation. About the topic, though, I feel like the chip shortage, the little I've known, because I don't watch the news a lot, that's been filtered into me, is that it was related to the same thing with shipping, right? And it sounds like the chip shortage was artificially created unintentionally because of politics, maybe. And that, to me, makes me chuckle a little bit because, you never really truly know what's going on. And so I feel bad for the people that have to suffer because. But this is pretty awesome to learn. I know there's companies out there that are important, like this company in the Netherlands that creates the laser. As a layperson, you always think things just happen. But as a professional, I've learned that no, things will just happen. There's actually people that you're actually relying on, and there's a whole system here. And this microchip semiconductor industry appears to be a small industry, made even smaller by all these external factors. And now we have a pressure on them, and our American economic ways are starting to fail us as we see how we've been in control for the last 50 years of the way we do things, where things are being produced, how it's all happening. And now as our motivations change and the people who were guiding this 50 years ago are no longer there and new people are in with different ideas, we see the results. So it'll be interesting. And it's really awesome to learn a little bit more about video gaming in general. I wouldn't have even thought, and now I have an idea what a microchip is. I mean, I had an idea before, but this is a little bit more robust. I feel educated, like I've entered the library of video gaming.
That was really eloquent, Elford. Worst case scenario, like in the worst case, we can always go to the deserted island I plan to go to and work on that coconut bamboo analog computer.
Do you want to do the outro, Phil?
Oh, wow. I would love to. Oh, my God. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. This has been great.
And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where Kevin, publishes the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Sequel by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Philip Thomas.
I'm Elford Stephens.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.